More on France's presidential elections and perhaps their effects on what's happening in Africa. We now speak to Tom Wheeler, former ambassador. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the program. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
All right, so battle lines are drawn. Although Macron is a centrist, him and Marine Le Pen are pretty much on polar sides.
That's right. She is very much a right-winger. She followed her father, who was also of that kind. And so they have very different approaches and points of view about questions of policy.
At 39, it was a surprise. He started his party En Marche just a year ago. What do you think has been the reason why France has gravitated towards this young man and this new line of politics?
I think, well, firstly, a lot of other parties have decided to support him. That would be the first point. And so the age question doesn't really make any difference.
So there are 26 countries that speak French in Africa. So whether we like it or not, even just by pure language, France continues to be quite an influence on the continent. What does a Le Pen presidency or a Macron presidency represent for the continent? Should we as a continent be rooting for one instead of the other? Let's start with Le Pen, because it seems that Europe doesn't really want her. Should we also be fearful of her?
Well, I think she is against immigration and refugees. In other words, you know, if you want to immigrate to France and she's the president, you're going to find it more difficult to be accepted in France as an immigrant. And then, of course, the same applies to refugees. That she's very much against refugees because they'll take jobs away from French people and so on. So, you know, it's not in Africa's interest for her to become president.
What about Macron? What's his story? Because he's a centrist, so I suppose he's trying to be the best of both worlds.
Yes, well, I don't think he's expressed any views on this particular one because he's so new in the job that he's got a lot to find out. It's difficult to know what his position would be.
I suppose a lot of that decisions actually is out of his hands, because if France stays in the European Union, then EU rules apply, and we know what those are.
Yeah, and so they would have to accept refugees which come from Africa, come from the Middle East, and even from Asia. So this is something that he wouldn't have a choice in. How
much influence does France still have in Africa? We've seen elections like in Ivory Coast and even Senegal, where people say that France's hands still seem to be a little strong in those regions. But there are 26 countries that do speak the language. How much influence does France still have?
I'm sure it has quite a considerable influence. Whether they take it right down to the election level, I don't know. I mean, I think they wouldn't want to be accused of manipulating elections to appoint a president or presidents of those countries who support France.
And I suppose because of the language, Africa naturally exports to France. And so economically, we're still an important partner as a continent to France.
Indeed, indeed. You know, those West African countries, because most of the French-speaking countries are in West Africa, they export things which are required in France. For instance, Ivory Coast produces a lot of coffee and various other products like this, the cotton and so on, which would all be very desirable for France and therefore valuable exports, bring in the money for these countries, which are generally pretty poor.
And South Africa, what should we be thinking as we watch this runoff between Le Pen and Macron?
Well, I think in the nature of our politics, Macron would have to be the one.
Right.
We don't really appreciate right-wing politicians much in this country anymore.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what it is, really, Le Pen. But can she win? Is there an outside chance? You know, we've had polls in the past. We didn't see Donald Trump winning, and I'm sure that David Cameron didn't see Britain actually voting to leave the European Union.
Yeah.
Is there an outside chance that Marine Le Pen could do something in the next 2 weeks and convince the French to join her?
I very much doubt that. I think this is slightly different to the cases that you've mentioned there, that she's not got anything particular to offer to the electorate, and you know, other than sort of right-wing rhetoric, and I think that would pretty much frighten away the voters.
But the Brexit story was about immigration, and it was sufficiently concerning. France has seen terrorism on the rise, people dying, and so perhaps the sentiment of having immigration limited might be so high up on the agenda that maybe voters might turn to her. Not enough.
Let me say, I hope not.
All right, well, let's see what happens on May the 7th.
Yes.
Tom Wheeler, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insights this evening.
It's been my pleasure.
All right, so May the 7th, that's the date to put on your diary. And as you heard there from Tom Wheeler, perhaps Macron might be a better choice for us given the movement of people from Africa to Europe. And if Marine Le Pen wins, well, one of the things that she's going to do straight away might be A, to leave the EU, and B, she'll block the borders, and we might not see some of our footballers playing well in the French leagues there. We're going to leave it there for the time being. We'll be back after this.